Welcome, wanderer of the waking world. Lay down your thoughts and step softly into the realm between dreaming and remembering. Tonight's story weaves together two seekers of the soul, Carl Gustav Jung, the cartographer of the collective unconscious, and Jordan Peterson, the translator of ancient wisdom into modern maps. Together and apart, they bridge the eternal symbols of myth with the pressing questions of contemporary existence. As you settle into bed, let the rhythm of my voice carry you closer to sleep, one idea at a time. Relax as we explore how these two minds approach the meaning-making capacity of human consciousness. One seeing the archetypal foundations of the psyche dwelling in timeless depths, the other discovering how these same patterns organize our navigation through chaos and order in everyday life. Their dialogue, whether spoken or across time, illuminates the vast territories of human consciousness. If you enjoy these quiet tales of psychological dialogue and wonder, press the like button and subscribe to join me on future journeys through the conversations between great minds. Tell me in the comments which psychological relationship intrigues you most, the mentor and student, the collaborators, the friendly rivals, and together we'll explore them in nights to come. Now, let the world fade. Drift with me through the intertwining paths of Jung and Peterson as we wander between their visions and listen to the echoes where their insights meet and part. In the vast tapestry of psychological thought, certain threads run through generations, connecting minds across decades and continents, weaving patterns that reveal themselves only when we step back and gaze at the whole. Carl Gustav Jung spent his lifetime charting territories of the human psyche that lie beneath personal memory, beneath individual experience, in what he called the collective unconscious. He was born in 1875, in an age when the world still moved to the rhythms of horse-drawn carriages and gaslight, when psychology itself was barely emerging from philosophy's shadow. Jung would live to see the atomic age, witnessing humanity's capacity for both unprecedented creation and unimaginable destruction. Through it all, he remained steadfast in his conviction that within the human soul lay patterns older than any individual, symbols that recur across cultures and centuries, because they arise from the very structure of human consciousness itself. Jordan Peterson was born nearly a century later, in 1962, in the small town of Fairview, Alberta, on the western edge of Canada's vast northern prairies. He came of age in a world Jung could barely have imagined, a world of television and computers, of suburban sprawl and nuclear anxiety, of traditional structures crumbling and new ones struggling to be born. Yet Peterson would find himself drawn inexorably to Jung's work, discovering in those earlier explorations of myth and archetype something essential that modern psychology had lost or deliberately cast aside. Where many of his contemporaries in psychology focused narrowly on measurable behaviors and cognitive processes, Peterson felt the pull of larger questions about meaning, about the stories that organize human experience, about why certain narratives repeat themselves across cultures and why they matter so profoundly to human beings. The relationship between Jung and Peterson is not one of teacher and student in any direct sense. Jung died in 1961, the year before Peterson was born, yet their connection runs deep, perhaps deeper than many relationships between contemporaries. Peterson encountered Jung's work as a young man searching for answers to questions that academic psychology seemed unwilling or unable to address. He found in Jung's writings something that resonated with his own emerging understanding of how human beings navigate existence, how we create meaning in a universe that does not automatically provide it, how we struggle between the known and the unknown, how ancient stories contain wisdom that remains urgently relevant. But to understand this relationship properly, we must begin at the beginning, with Jung himself in the period when his most relevant ideas were crystallizing. Let us drift back to Switzerland in the early decades of the 20th century, to a time when Jung was establishing his analytical psychology as distinct from Freud's psychoanalysis, when he was beginning to articulate his vision of archetypes and the collective unconscious. Jung's break with Freud between 1912 and 1913 marked not merely a professional disagreement, but a fundamental divergence in their understanding of human nature. Where Freud saw the unconscious as primarily personal, as the repository of repressed wishes and traumatic memories, Jung began to perceive layers beneath the personal, unconscious layers that no individual experience could account for, patterns that seemed to exist prior to any individual's existence. His patients' dreams contained imagery they had never consciously encountered. Myths from cultures they had never studied appeared spontaneously in their visions and fantasies. Jung could not explain this simply through personal history. Something else was at work, something deeper. During his own descent into the unconscious between 1913 and 1919, what he would later call his confrontation with the unconscious, Jung experienced directly the power of these transpersonal images. He allowed figures to emerge from his own depths, engage them in what he termed active imagination, and discovered that they had their own coherence, their own wisdom, their own autonomy. The anima, the wise old man, the shadow, these were not merely metaphors, but living realities within the psyche. They represented fundamental patterns of human experience, structures that shaped consciousness in ways both subtle and profound. Jung's concept of archetypes evolved gradually over decades. Initially, he thought of them as inherited images, collective memories from humanity's past. Later, he refined this understanding, recognizing that what was inherited was not the images themselves, but the predisposition to form certain types of images. Archetypes were like the dry riverbeds that water will naturally flow through, the patterns that human experience naturally takes. The mother archetype does not mean every culture has identical mother goddesses, but rather that the relationship between infant and mother creates experiences so universal, so fundamental to human existence, that they become organizing principles in the psyche. Around this archetypal core, cultures weave their specific myths, religions build their specific doctrines, and individuals construct their specific complexes. By the time Jung published his major, works in the 1920s, 30s, and 40s, he had developed a sophisticated understanding of how these archetypal patterns operate. They are never encountered in pure form, he explained, but always clothed in the garments of culture, always mediated through symbol and story. The hero's journey appears in Greek myth and African folktale, in medieval romance and modern cinema, not because of cultural transmission primarily, but because the hero's journey represents something fundamental about human psychological development. The need to venture forth from the familiar, to confront challenges, to be transformed, and to return bearing gifts for the community. Jung understood myths not as primitive pre-scientific explanations for natural phenomena, but as the psyche's way of representing its own processes. The symbols in myths are the same symbols that appear in dreams because both arise from the same source, the collective unconscious, that vast repository of human, psychological potential that each individual carries within. To interpret a myth properly, one must understand it psychologically, must recognize in its dramatis personae the various aspects of the psyche itself, see in its narratives the processes by which consciousness develops and individuates. This brings us to Jung's concept of individuation, the process by which a person becomes truly themselves, realizes their unique potential, while simultaneously connecting with universal patterns. Individuation is not about ego inflation or narcissistic self-realization. Rather, it involves recognizing and integrating the various aspects of oneself, the shadow parts we reject, the contrasexual elements we project onto others, the archetypal energies that move through us. It requires what Jung called the transcendent function, the capacity to hold opposing elements in consciousness simultaneously until a new third position emerges, one that transcends the original opposites while honoring both. For Jung, the psyche is inherently self-regulating, constantly seeking balance and wholeness. When consciousness becomes too one-sided, the unconscious produces compensatory material in dreams and fantasies. The Western rationalistic ego that denies the irrational is confronted by the irrational erupting into its ordered world. The person who identifies entirely with goodness and light is haunted by their shadow. Health lies not in perfection, but in ongoing relationship between conscious and unconscious, in the dynamic balance Jung called the conjunctio, the marriage of opposites. This was the body of work, developed over Jung's long career until his death in 1961, that would wait in libraries and bookstores for a young Canadian student to discover it. Jung had spent his life excavating the foundations of human meaning-making, revealing the mythic structures beneath modern consciousness, arguing that secular rationalism had cut Western humanity off from its roots in the symbolic life. He warned that a society which dismisses its myths and symbols, which tries to live by reason alone, would find those rejected elements returning in dangerous forms in political fanaticism, in collective psychoses, in the eruption of the archaic unconscious through channels that conscious culture could no longer mediate or contain. Now let us turn our attention northward and forward in time, to the Canadian prairies in the 1960s and 70s, where a boy named Jordan Peterson was growing up in the small towns and wilderness edges of Alberta. Peterson's childhood was marked by the vast landscapes of northern Canada, endless skies, forests that stretched beyond sight, the real possibility of getting lost or encountering danger. This geographic context would later inform his thinking about order and chaos, about the small island of the known, surrounded by the great ocean of the unknown. Peterson has spoken of being troubled from a young age by questions about human evil and human suffering. Growing up in the shadow of World War II and the Holocaust, coming of age during the Cold War with its nuclear anxiety, he could not accept easy answers about human nature. How could ordinary people participate in atrocities? What prevented societies from descending into totalitarian nightmare? What gave life meaning when suffering was inevitable and death waited for everyone? These questions drove him toward psychology, but not the behaviorism that dominated North American psychology in the 1970s and 80s. That reductionist approach, which treated humans as mere stimulus response machines, seemed to Peterson to miss everything important about human experience. As an undergraduate at Grande Prairie Regional College and then the University of Alberta, Peterson studied political science and psychology, driven by these questions about ideology and evil. He read voraciously beyond his coursework: Dostoevsky, Nietzsche, Solzhenitsyn, Orwell. He was particularly struck by Solzhenitsyn's analysis of Soviet totalitarianism, by the Russian writer's insistence that the line between good and evil runs through every human heart, not between groups or nations. This insight would become foundational to Peterson's thinking. Evil is not something only others are capable of, but a potential within every person, something that must be recognized and consciously guarded against. During his graduate studies at McGill University in Montreal, Peterson began working with Robert Peel, studying the biological and psychological bases of aggression and alcohol abuse. But his interests kept pulling him toward larger questions. He became fascinated by Jean Piaget's work on cognitive development, particularly the idea that children don't simply accumulate knowledge, but actively construct models of reality, and that these models develop through stages. Even more influential was his encounter with the work of neuropsychologist Jeffrey Gray, whose approach to personality emphasized biological emotion systems and the fundamental distinction between systems that approach and systems that avoid, between mechanisms for exploring potential and mechanisms for protection from threat. It was during this period, in the mid-1980s, that Peterson discovered Jung. The encounter was not through any formal coursework. Jung was largely dismissed or ignored in academic psychology by then, considered too mystical, too unscientific, too focused on subjective experience rather than measurable behavior. Peterson found Jung on his own, following the threads of his questions about meaning and myth. He also discovered Joseph Campbell, the comparative mythologist whose work on the hero's journey and the functions of mythology was explicitly Jungian in orientation. Campbell's books, particularly The Hero with a Thousand Faces and the Masks of God series, showed Peterson how the same mythic patterns recur across cultures: creation myths, flood myths, virgin births, death and resurrection, the hero's journey. Campbell, following Jung, argued that these patterns recur because they represent something real about human psychology, about the challenges of human development, and the structure of human experience. This was revelatory for Peterson. Here was an approach that took seriously both scientific psychology and the ancient wisdom traditions, that saw them not as contradictory, but as complementary ways of understanding human nature. Peterson read Jung extensively: Symbols of Transformation, Aeon, Answer to Job, The Collected Works. He found Jung's writing difficult, digressive, sometimes maddeningly unclear, but also profound. Jung was wrestling with something that academic psychology had given up on: the question of meaning, the role of symbol and story in organizing human experience, the relationship between individual psychology and the collective, patterns that transcend any individual. Where behaviorism treated meaning as essentially irrelevant and cognitive psychology reduced it to information processing, Jung placed meaning-making at the very center of psychological life. But Peterson did not simply absorb Jung uncritically. Even early on, he recognized limitations in Jung's approach. Jung was brilliant at phenomenology, at describing the symbolic life of the psyche, but vaguer about mechanisms, about how exactly these archetypal patterns operated. Jung's concept of the collective unconscious remained somewhat mysterious, inherited but not genetic, universal but culturally expressed, powerful but not always clearly defined. Peterson, trained in empirical psychology, wanted to ground these insights in a more rigorous framework. This led Peterson to integrate Jung's ideas with other streams of psychological research. He was particularly influenced by evolutionary psychology's insights about innate human tendencies, by neuroscience's mapping of emotion and motivation systems in the brain, by personality psychology's dimensional approaches. He studied how animals and humans respond to novelty and threat, how hierarchies form in social groups, how narrative structures organize experience and memory. All of this was building toward what would become his magnum opus, the book Maps of Meaning, which he began writing in the late 1980s and would work on for years. Maps of Meaning represents Peterson's attempt to synthesize Jung's insights about myth and archetype with empirical psychology, neuroscience, and evolutionary theory. The book's central argument is that human beings don't experience the world as neutral objects and facts, but as value-laden, meaningful, organized into categories of beneficial, harmful, or unknown. This organization happens largely unconsciously, and largely through stories, the narratives we inherit from culture, the myths and religions that tell us what is valuable, what is dangerous, how to act, what it all means. For Peterson, the fundamental mythic structure is the division between order and chaos. Order represents the known, the predictable, the mastered, the realm where our actions produce expected results. Chaos represents the unknown, the unpredictable, the not yet mastered, the realm where our models break down and we don't know what will happen. Human beings exist perpetually at the boundary between these two realms. Too much order leads to stagnation, rigidity, tyranny. Too much chaos leads to anxiety, dissolution, terror. The ideal is to position oneself at the border, with one foot in the known and one in the unknown, secure enough to be stable, but challenged enough to grow. This formulation is clearly influenced by Jung's understanding of consciousness and the unconscious, of the ego's need to relate properly to the unknown depths of the psyche. But Peterson grounds it more explicitly in neuroscience and evolutionary psychology. The brain has distinct systems for dealing with explored versus unexplored territory, for processing the familiar versus the novel. These systems are evolutionarily ancient, present in humans and many other animals. Our myths and stories, Peterson argues, are representations of how to navigate between these realms. The hero ventures into chaos, confronts what is unknown and threatening, extracts something valuable, and brings it back to order, renewing and revitalizing the community. This is clearly a Jungian interpretation of myth, but with a more operational and pragmatic focus. For Jung, myths represent primarily psychological realities, processes within the individual psyche. For Peterson, myths are also, and perhaps primarily, guides to action, maps for navigating the world. They tell us what to pay attention to, how to behave, what goals to pursue. A culture's myths are its implicit theories of action and perception, passed down across generations because they contain accumulated wisdom about how to live. Peterson completed his Ph.D. at McGill in 1991 and took a position at Harvard University, where he continued developing these ideas while teaching courses on personality psychology and the psychology of myth and religion. His Harvard courses, particularly his Maps of Meaning course, attracted devoted followings of students hungry for the kinds of big questions and synthesizing frameworks that were largely absent from academic psychology. Here was a professor willing to discuss Dostoevsky and Genesis alongside neuroscience and personality research, who took seriously the question of how to live a meaningful life in a tragic world. During the Harvard years, and then after moving to the University of Toronto in 1998, Peterson continued refining his ideas about archetypes, myths, and meaning. He was influenced by the Russian neuropsychologist Alexander Luria's work on how brain damage affects narrative, organization of experience. He studied how stories and narratives function in memory and identity formation. He explored the relationship between personality dimensions like conscientiousness and neuroticism, and the mythic categories of order and chaos. All the while, Jung remained a foundational influence, the thinker who had first recognized that myths are not primitive errors but sophisticated expressions of psychological reality. By the time Peterson achieved widespread public prominence in the mid-2010s, first through his biblical lectures on YouTube and then through the controversy surrounding Canadian Bill C-16 and his subsequent book 12 Rules for Life, his Jungian foundations were well established. His approach to interpreting biblical stories was explicitly Jungian, seeing them not primarily as historical accounts or moral prescriptions, but as stories containing archetypal wisdom about human psychology. When Peterson discussed Cain and Abel, he was discussing envy and resentment and the catastrophic consequences of comparing oneself unfavorably to others. When he discussed the Garden of Eden, he was discussing the development of self-consciousness and knowledge of mortality. When he discussed Noah's Ark, he was discussing the necessity of preserving what is valuable during times of chaos and transformation. This interpretive approach came directly from Jung, who had spent decades analyzing religious symbolism psychologically. Jung's Answer to Job reinterpreted the biblical story of Job as representing the development of moral consciousness, with God himself undergoing transformation through the encounter. His Aeon analyzed the symbolism of Christ in psychological terms as representing the self-archetype, the totality and center of the psyche. Peterson was following this same method, translating ancient religious texts into psychological language, arguing that their enduring power comes from their encapsulation of archetypal truths about human nature. But here we must pause and recognize a significant difference. Jung approached religious symbols with a kind of phenomenological neutrality, interested in what they reveal about the psyche, but not claiming they provide moral guidance for behavior. Jung was a psychologist and, in his own way, a mystic, someone interested in the experience of the numinous and its effects on consciousness. Peterson approaches these symbols more normatively, more prescriptively. For Peterson, myths and religious stories don't just describe psychological realities, they prescribe how we should act. They contain implicit knowledge about how to live properly, and understanding them can guide behavior in concrete ways. This difference reflects their different historical moments and concerns. Jung lived through the collapse of traditional Christian culture in Europe, through the catastrophes of 2 world wars, and was trying to understand what remained valid in religious symbols after literal belief had become impossible for many Western intellectuals. He was answering the question, what do these symbols mean psychologically, independent of their truth claims? Peterson, living in a Western culture several decades further into secular modernity, is more concerned with the consequences of losing those traditional frameworks entirely. He sees the dangers of nihilism, the attraction of destructive ideologies, the loss of meaning that afflicts individuals when traditional structures collapse without adequate replacement. He is asking, what wisdom do these old stories contain that we desperately need to recover? This brings us to the heart of the relationship between Jung and Peterson, a relationship conducted across time, mediated through texts, manifesting as influence rather than dialogue, yet profound in its implications for how we understand human psychology and the role of myth and symbol in human life. To explore this relationship more deeply, we must now turn to a detailed comparison of their core ideas, examining where they converge and where they diverge. listening for the harmonies and tensions in their different approaches to the same fundamental questions about meaning, symbol, and the human capacity to create order from chaos. Let us begin with the concept of archetypes, the foundation of Jung's analytical psychology, and a central element in Peterson's thinking about meaning and myth. For Jung, archetypes are structural elements of the collective unconscious, inherited potentials for forming certain types of images and having certain types of experiences. They are not inherited ideas, but inherited possibilities, the forms that psychological contents naturally take. The mother archetype, for instance, is not a specific image of a mother goddess, but the potential to experience and imagine the nourishing, protective, and also potentially devouring aspects of the maternal. Every culture clothes this archetype in different images: Demeter, Kali, Mary, the earth goddess. But the underlying pattern is universal because it arises from the universal experience of infancy and helplessness, of dependence on a powerful, nurturing figure. Jung identified numerous archetypes: the self, the shadow, the anima and animus, the wise old man, the trickster, the hero, the divine child. Each represents a fundamental pattern of human experience and potential. The self is the totality and center of the psyche, represented in symbols of wholeness like mandalas and quaternities. The shadow is the rejected, repressed aspects of the personality, all that we refuse to acknowledge in ourselves. The anima and animus are the contrasexual elements in men and women respectively, the feminine in the masculine psyche and vice versa. The hero represents the ego's struggle to establish itself and meet challenges. The trickster represents the disruption of established order, the relativization of fixed positions. For Jung, these archetypal figures appear spontaneously in dreams, fantasies, and cultural products because they are built into the structure of the psyche itself. They are autonomous in the sense that they operate according to their own patterns, not under ego control. When someone says they had a dream they didn't choose or create, they're right. The dream comes from the unconscious, and it often expresses archetypal themes that the conscious ego may not understand or even want to acknowledge. Engaging with these archetypal figures, learning to recognize them and relate to them consciously, is central to the individuation process. Peterson also works extensively with archetypes, but his approach differs in important ways. For Peterson, archetypes are primarily patterns of behavior and perception that have been abstracted into representations over evolutionary time. They are implicit knowledge about regularities in the world and effective ways of acting in different situations. The terrible mother, for instance, represents not just the psychological experience of the devouring maternal, but also the real dangers of overprotection, smothering, the prevention of necessary development. The wise king represents patterns of beneficial leadership and social hierarchy. The hero represents the pattern of voluntarily confronting what is unknown and threatening. Peterson grounds these archetypal patterns more explicitly in evolutionary psychology and neuroscience than Jung did. He argues that we have evolved pattern recognition systems that abstract regularities from experience, and archetypes are very high-level abstractions, patterns of patterns, if you will. They represent the kinds of situations and entities that have been significant across human evolutionary history: predators and prey, mates and rivals, parents and children, leaders and followers, dangerous unknowns and safe havens. For Peterson, archetypes are embedded in stories because stories are the primary way human beings abstract patterns from experience and transmit them across generations. A myth is essentially a very refined representation of successful and unsuccessful patterns of being and acting. The hero's journey encodes in narrative form a pattern that has proven adaptive across many contexts. Identify a challenge or opportunity, prepare yourself, venture forth voluntarily to meet it, overcome obstacles through courage and wisdom, return transformed and able to share what you've gained. This pattern applies to hunting expeditions in ancestral environments and to graduate school in modern ones, which is why the story remains compelling and useful. Here we can see both convergence and divergence. Both Jung and Peterson recognize archetypes as universal patterns that structure human experience and appear in myths across cultures. Both understand that these patterns have profound psychological significance and that stories carry important wisdom. But Jung emphasizes the archetypal patterns as primarily intrapsychic, as structures within the psyche that need to be recognized and integrated for psychological wholeness. Peterson emphasizes them as maps for action, as guides for behavior in the world, as extracted wisdom about how to navigate between order and chaos. This difference becomes even clearer when we examine how they understand the relationship between order and chaos, perhaps the central polarity in Peterson's thinking, and one that clearly parallels Jung's conscious-unconscious dialectic. For Peterson, order and chaos are the fundamental categories through which human beings experience reality. Order is explored territory, where your actions produce predictable results, where you know the rules and how to act. It's culture, tradition, the known world. Chaos is unexplored territory, the domain of novelty and uncertainty, where you don't know what will happen, where established patterns break down. It's nature, the unknown, the source of both. Threat and opportunity. Peterson often uses the ancient Chinese symbol of yin and yang to represent this duality, with the caveat that yin, typically associated with the feminine, represents chaos, while yang, associated with masculine, represents order. He argues that this symbolic association is not arbitrary, but reflects deep biological realities about different reproductive strategies and social roles across mammalian evolution, though he's careful to note that these are generalizations about distributions, not absolute categories, and that both men and women contain and need both order and chaos. Human life, for Peterson, requires balancing these two realms. Too much order leads to rigidity, totalitarian tyranny, stagnation. Everything becomes so rule-bound and predictable that growth stops, creativity dies, the system becomes brittle and unable to adapt. The person or society trapped in pure order is like Pinocchio, trapped in the belly of the whale, imprisoned in protection. Conversely, too much chaos leads to anxiety, disintegration, meaninglessness. Everything is uncertain and threatening. No stable ground exists. Action becomes paralyzed because all frameworks for understanding and acting have dissolved. This is the state of extreme trauma or psychotic breakdown. The ideal is to position yourself at the boundary between order and chaos, with one foot planted in what you know and one stepping into what you don't. This is the state of flow, of optimal challenge, where you're secure enough to be stable, but challenged enough to develop. This is where meaning is found, not in pure safety and not in pure chaos, but in the active engagement with the unknown while maintaining connection to the known. For Jung, the parallel polarity is between consciousness and the unconscious, or more specifically, between the ego and the unconscious. Consciousness is ordered, rational, controlled, oriented, by the ego's intentions and understanding. The unconscious is chaotic in the sense of being unordered by conscious intentions, operating according to its own logic, containing contradictions, following patterns of association and symbol rather than rational sequences. The unconscious is the source of both creativity and destruction, of neurosis and transformation. Jung understood psychological health as requiring a proper relationship between ego and unconscious. The ego cannot simply dominate, suppressing and controlling everything that arises from the depths. This leads to neurosis, to the return of the repressed in symptomatic forms. Nor can the ego be overwhelmed by the unconscious. This leads to psychosis, to the dissolution of ego boundaries and orientation. Instead, the ego must be strong enough to engage with the unconscious, to receive its messages in dreams and fantasies, to integrate its contents without being destroyed or absorbed. This process requires what Jung called the transcendent function, the capacity to hold, conscious and unconscious, rational and irrational, order and chaos together in tension until something new emerges, a third position that transcends the original opposition while honoring both poles. This is the central movement in individuation, the ongoing dialectic through which the personality develops and the self gradually manifests. The parallels with Peterson's order-chaos polarity are clear. Both are describing a fundamental duality in human experience. Both emphasize the need for balance and integration rather than one-sided domination. Both see health as a dynamic engagement between these poles rather than a static state. But the emphases differ. Jung's focus is more on intra-psychic balance, on the individual's internal relationship with their own unconscious contents. Peterson's focus is more on behavioral and perceptual orientation in the world, on how one navigates between the known and unknown in actual situations and environments. Peterson operationalizes these concepts more directly into guidelines for action. Stand up straight with your shoulders back. This is about presenting yourself as competent and capable, about occupying a position in the social hierarchy with dignity. Treat yourself like someone you are responsible for helping. This is about recognizing your own value and acting accordingly. Pursue what is meaningful, not what is expedient. This is about orienting yourself toward long-term flourishing rather than short-term pleasure or safety. These rules are practical applications of what Peterson sees as archetypal wisdom, translated into modern behavioral advice. Jung was less inclined to offer such direct prescriptions. His advice to patients was typically to attend to their dreams, to engage in active imagination, to notice what the unconscious was trying to communicate, and to work toward integrating the insights that emerged. He trusted the self-regulating nature of the psyche. If the patient could establish a proper relationship with the unconscious, the psyche would naturally move toward wholeness. Jung was more comfortable with ambiguity, with the recognition that what is right for one person may not be right for another, that the individuation process is unique for each individual, even though it follows archetypal patterns. This difference in prescriptiveness extends to their understanding of morality. For Peterson, morality is fundamentally about action in the world, about behavior that sustains and improves being rather than increasing suffering and destruction. His ethics are consequentialist in a certain sense. Actions are good if they lead to flourishing and development, bad if they lead to tyranny and chaos. But they're not crudely utilitarian, because Peterson recognizes that what leads to genuine long-term flourishing is often not what produces short-term pleasure or utility maximization. Meaningful engagement with challenges, voluntary adoption of responsibility, truthful speech. These are good not because they maximize happiness, but because they create the conditions for sustainable individual and collective thriving. Peterson grounds this moral vision explicitly in the structure of reality as he understands it. The world really does divide into order and chaos. Human beings really do need to balance these realms. Certain patterns of action really do lead to sustainable outcomes, while others lead to catastrophe. This isn't arbitrary cultural construction, but reflects the deep structure of being itself. Therefore, the wisdom encoded in myths and religious traditions about how to live properly is not mere opinion or cultural preference, but distilled knowledge about the nature of reality and human nature within it. Jung's approach to morality was more complex and less directive. He recognized the danger of what he called nothing but morality, the view that only one way is right and all else is wrong. This kind of moral absolutism, Jung argued, often reflects a too rigid conscious position that denies the reality of the shadow, of the moral darkness that exists within every person. The person who is absolutely certain of their righteousness, who identifies entirely with the good, is dangerous because they have not acknowledged their own capacity for evil, and therefore that evil operates unconsciously and unmonitored. For Jung, ethical development requires acknowledging one's shadow, recognizing one's capacity for evil, and consciously choosing not to act on destructive impulses precisely because one knows oneself capable of them. This is quite different from the morality of innocence, where one is good because one has never been tempted or doesn't recognize one's own dark potential. Solzhenitsyn's insight that the line between good and evil runs through every human heart was Jungian before Solzhenitsyn articulated it, and Peterson himself is very much in this tradition, emphasizing that we must acknowledge our capacity for malevolence in order to choose against it consciously. But Jung was more comfortable with moral ambiguity than Peterson seems to be. Jung recognized that what appears as good from one perspective may be destructive from another, that the psyche contains genuine contradictions that cannot always be resolved into clear prescriptions. The self contains both good and evil, light and dark, construction and destruction. Wholeness includes the shadow, not through acting it out, but through acknowledging it and integrating its energy in transformed ways. Jung was suspicious of any ethical system that claimed to have all the answers, seeing this as a defense against the genuine complexity and darkness of human nature. Peterson, while acknowledging that line between good and evil within the heart, is more confident about general principles for action. Tell the truth, or at least don't lie. Take responsibility. Orient yourself toward meaning rather than expedience. Stand up against tyranny, even if it's difficult. These are not presented as mere personal preferences, but as principles derivable from the structure of being, validated by myth and tradition and psychological understanding. There is a certain stoic or existentialist quality to Peterson's ethics, a sense that we are responsible for our choices, that we must act in the face of tragedy and limitation. That meaningful engagement with life's challenges is both possible and necessary. This brings us to their different relationships with religious symbolism and tradition. Jung's relationship with Christianity, the tradition he was raised in, was complex. His father was a Protestant pastor who, Jung believed, suffered because his faith was conventional rather than alive, based on creed rather than experience. Jung rejected traditional Christian theology in many respects, but spent his life exploring Christian symbols psychologically. He saw the development of Christian symbolism as reflecting the evolution of Consciousness in the West, the shift from polytheism to monotheism, representing the development of unified consciousness. The Trinity, representing a more complex understanding of God. The absence of feminine divine figures, representing a problematic one-sidedness. In answer to Job, Jung presented a provocative interpretation of the Book of Job, suggesting that Job's challenge to God represents humanity developing moral consciousness, and that God himself undergoes transformation through this encounter, eventually incarnating as Christ to experience human suffering directly. This was not theology in any orthodox sense, but psychological interpretation, reading the story as a drama within the collective psyche of Western humanity. Jung believed that modern Western culture needed new symbols to replace the Christian ones that no longer carried numinous power for many people. He was interested in Eastern religions, in alchemy, in Gnosticism, anywhere that symbol systems existed that might help modern individuals reconnect with a symbolic life. He saw his own concept of individuation as a modern formulation of the religious process, the secular equivalent of what religious traditions had always aimed at: the transformation and completion of the individual personality, connection with something greater than the ego. Peterson's relationship with religious tradition is different. He approaches the biblical stories with something more like reverence, seeing them as containing hard-won wisdom that should not be casually discarded. His biblical lecture series, which brought him to widespread attention, treated Genesis and Exodus as profound psychological documents whose narratives encode essential truths about human nature and the human condition. The story of Adam and Eve contains insights about the development of self-consciousness and knowledge of vulnerability and mortality. The story of Cain and Abel illuminates the psychology of resentment and revenge. The story of Abraham and Isaac explores the relationship between tradition and renewal, between devotion to the old order and openness to the new. Peterson is less interested in creating new symbols or finding replacements for traditional religious frameworks than in recovering what was valuable in those frameworks, translating their insights into modern psychological language, but preserving their essential wisdom. He is critical of the tendency in Western intellectual culture to dismiss traditional religious narratives as primitive superstition or oppressive ideology. This dismissal, Peterson argues, throws out accumulated wisdom that took millennia to develop and that modern secular frameworks have not successfully replaced. There is a practical urgency to Peterson's engagement with traditional wisdom that differs from Jung's more exploratory, phenomenological approach. Jung was fascinated by symbols for what they revealed about the psyche. Peterson is concerned with symbols because of what happens when societies lose them: the spread of nihilism, the attraction of totalizing ideologies, the loss of meaning that can make life feel unbearable. Where Jung was investigating the symbolic life, Peterson is advocating for it, arguing that we abandon traditional narratives and symbols at our peril. This difference reflects their different historical moments. Jung lived through the catastrophe of European civilization in 2 world wars, which he interpreted as eruptions of the collective unconscious, the return of repressed archetypal energies in destructive forms. But he still inhabited a world where Christianity was the dominant cultural framework, even if increasingly hollowed out. Peterson writes, in a Western culture decades further into secularization, where traditional frameworks have much less cultural authority, where many people grow up without any coherent mythological or religious framework at all, the question has shifted from how do we understand the old symbols psychologically to how do we recover wisdom that has been lost and that we desperately need. This brings us to their different understandings of hierarchies and power, themes that are central to Peterson's work but less emphasized in Jung's. Peterson argues that hierarchies are not arbitrary social constructions, but natural organizational structures that appear across species and cultures because they solve real problems about resource distribution and social distribution. Coordination. Dominance hierarchies exist in lobsters, in wolves, in primates, and in humans. While the specific criteria for status vary, physical strength, hunting, prowess, wealth, knowledge, the basic structure of some individuals having higher status than others is universal. For Peterson, hierarchies are not inherently oppressive, though they can become corrupted and tyrannical. A properly functioning hierarchy rewards competence and prosocial behavior, provides order and stability, allows specialization and division of labor. The alternative to hierarchy is not egalitarian utopia, but chaos and violence, the war of all against all. Might makes right in its crudest form. The question is not whether hierarchies will exist, but whether they will be fair, whether they will select for genuine competence and contribution or become instruments of arbitrary power and exploitation. This understanding of hierarchy is connected to Peterson's interpretation of the archetypal structure of society. The wise king represents beneficial hierarchy, leadership that creates and maintains order while remaining open to renewal and transformation. The tyrant represents corrupt hierarchy, power used for domination rather than service, order that has become rigid and refuses necessary change. The society needs hierarchy, but also needs hierarchies to be constantly evaluated and challenged, individuals to rise based on merit, systems to adapt and evolve. Peterson's emphasis on hierarchy and competence has been controversial, interpreted by critics as justifying existing power structures and inequalities. Peterson would respond that acknowledging the existence and necessity of hierarchies is not the same as claiming any particular hierarchy is just, and that genuine conservative recognition of the value of what works must be balanced with liberal openness to change and reform. The hero's journey itself involves challenging the old order when it becomes tyrannical, descending into chaos to retrieve new knowledge and return to transform the kingdom. Jung was less explicitly focused on social hierarchies and more on the archetypal patterns of individuation and psychological development within individuals. He recognized archetypal patterns of rulership, the king, the queen, the tyrant, but primarily as intrapsychic structures, elements of the individual psyche rather than templates for social organization. The king archetype represents the ordering, principle within the psyche, the aspect that organizes and rules the personality. When this is functioning properly, there is order and coherence in the personality. When it becomes tyrannical, the ego becomes too rigid and controlling, suppressing all spontaneity and creativity. Jung's focus was more on the individual's relationship to the collective than on the structure of the collective itself. He was concerned with how individuals could maintain psychological independence and wholeness in the face of collective movements in mass psychology. He saw the great danger of modernity as individuals losing their individual centers and being absorbed into collective identities, political movements, nationalist fervor, ideological possession. The individuated person stands apart from the collective while still maintaining relationship with it, neither isolated nor dissolved. This difference in emphasis, Peterson, on the structure and navigation of social hierarchies, Jung on individual psychological development and independence from collective absorption, reflects their different primary concerns. Peterson is more directly engaged with questions of social and political philosophy, with how society should be organized and how individuals should conduct themselves within social structures. Jung was more focused on the depths of the individual psyche and the process of psychological transformation. Yet both share a profound concern with totalitarianism and ideological possession. Jung witnessed the rise of Nazism with horror, seeing it as a catastrophic eruption of the collective unconscious. The archetypal figure of Wotan, the ancient Germanic god of storm and war, possessing the German people. He wrote about this explicitly, trying to understand how an entire sophisticated culture could fall into such madness. For Jung, this was what happens when the symbolic life is denied, when rationalism dismisses the numinous and archetypal energies have no proper channels, they return in monstrous forms, possessing individuals and collectives. Peterson similarly sees 20th century totalitarianism, both Nazi and Soviet, as central to understanding human nature and the stakes of how we organize societies and individual psyches. His early work was driven by trying to understand how ordinary people could participate in or enable atrocities, how ideologies could capture otherwise decent individuals and turn them into instruments of terror. Like Jung, he sees ideology as a kind of possession, a reduction of complex reality to simplistic narratives of oppressor and oppressed, a certainty that justifies any action in service of the ideological vision. Both Jung and Peterson emphasize the importance of individual consciousness and responsibility as bulwarks against ideological possession. For Jung, this meant the ongoing work of individuation, of maintaining a conscious relationship with one's own unconscious, of recognizing one's shadow and one's capacity for evil rather than projecting it all onto others. For Peterson, it means similar things but formulated more as behavioral injunctions: take responsibility for yourself, clean up your own life before trying to change the world, be willing to recognize your own malevolence rather than attributing all evil to systems or others. The convergence here is strong. Both see unconsciousness, whether psychological or ideological, as dangerous. Both emphasize the necessity of individual development and consciousness. Both recognize that human beings have the capacity for extraordinary evil when caught in collective movements or when acting out unacknowledged shadow material. Both see traditional wisdom and mythic understanding as resources for maintaining orientation in the face of these dangers. But again, Peterson's approach is more prescriptive and more focused on explicit action in the world. Jung trusted the psyche's self-regulating nature and encouraged people to attend to their dreams and inner processes. Peterson offers rules for life, specific guidelines for action, drawn from his understanding of archetypal wisdom, but formulated as concrete behavioral principles. Tell the truth. Stand up straight. Pursue meaning. Compare yourself to who you were yesterday, not to who someone else is today. Pet a cat when you encounter one on the street. This operationalization of Jungian insights into practical wisdom is one of Peterson's distinctive contributions. Jung explored the archetypal depths and described what he found. Peterson translates those findings into advice for living, into maps that modern individuals can use to navigate between order and chaos. This translation involves both extension and reduction. Extension in making the insights more practically applicable and accessible, reduction in that some of the symbolic richness and ambiguity necessarily gets simplified in the translation to behavioral advice. Consider Peterson's emphasis on truthfulness, one of his central ethical principles. Tell the truth, or at least don't lie. This is presented as a practical, actionable rule, but it has deep roots in Peterson's understanding of order, chaos, and meaning. Lying distorts the relationship between your model of the world and reality, making your map less accurate and therefore less useful for navigation. It creates disorder that compounds over time as lies require more lies to maintain. Truthfulness, even when difficult, maintains the integrity of your relationship with reality and enables course correction when your models are wrong. It is fundamentally a principle about maintaining accurate orientation in a complex and partly unknown world. For Jung, truth was more complex and paradoxical. Psychological truth was not the same as objective factual truth. Dreams lie and tell truth simultaneously. A statement can be literally false but symbolically true, capturing a psychological reality, even if it misrepresents external facts. Jung was less concerned with behavioral principles like truthfulness and more concerned with authenticity and integration, being true to oneself, recognizing and acknowledging all aspects of one's nature rather than living a one-sided conscious persona while the shadow acts out unconsciously. This doesn't mean Jung endorsed lying, but rather that his focus was different on the truth of the psyche, on symbolic truth, on the reality of psychological experience, even when it contradicts external facts or conscious beliefs. Peterson's emphasis on truthfulness is more pragmatic, more oriented toward effective action in the world, more concerned with the consequences of dishonesty for individual character and social trust. Now we must turn to their methodologies, the actual practices through which they engaged with the psyche and with others. Jung's primary methods were analysis and active imagination. In analysis, he listened to patients' dreams, invited free association, watched for patterns and recurring symbols. He paid attention to when something felt numinous or charged with significance. He looked for archetypal themes appearing in individual material and helped patients recognize these universal patterns in their personal experiences. Active imagination was Jung's distinctive technique for engaging the unconscious directly. He would invite patients, and he practiced this himself, to allow images to emerge spontaneously from the unconscious, then to engage those images consciously, to ask them questions, to allow them to speak, to follow where they led. This was not passive fantasy, but active dialogue with autonomous aspects of the psyche. The figures encountered in active imagination were treated as real in their own right, not as inventions to be manipulated, but as manifestations of unconscious contents that had their own integrity and wisdom. Jung also used methods like word association tests, painting, and artistic expression, sand play, and interpretation of cultural products, art, literature, religion, alchemy. He was comfortable with a wide range of approaches, united by the underlying principle of attending to symbolic expressions of the unconscious and working toward integration of conscious and unconscious contents. Peterson's methodology is somewhat different, reflecting his academic training and context. He has conducted empirical research in personality psychology, studying topics like aggression, alcohol abuse, and the relationship between personality traits and political beliefs. He has developed and used psychometric instruments to measure individual differences. His research has been published in peer-reviewed journals in mainstream academic psychology. But Peterson has also worked clinically as a therapist in private practice, drawing on insights from Jung, existentialism, and cognitive behavioral therapy. In his clinical work, he has helped clients identify the stories they're living within, the often unconscious narratives that organize their perceptions and actions. He has worked with people to articulate their values and goals, to recognize the ways they may be sabotaging themselves, to adopt more functional patterns of thinking and behaving. Peterson's self-authoring program, developed with colleagues, is an operationalization of these ideas into a structured writing exercise. Participants write about their past, articulating the story of their life and what they've learned. They write about their present personality, virtues, and faults. They write about their desired future and their feared future, then develop specific plans to move toward the desired future and away from the feared one. This is explicitly about helping people construct meaningful narratives of their lives, recognize patterns, and plan for development. It's more structured and directive than Jungian analysis, more focused on explicit articulation and planning, but it shares the underlying assumption that narrative organization is fundamental to human psychology. Peterson's public teaching, particularly his lectures on psychology and religious texts, represents another methodological approach, the public interpretation of symbolic material, making explicit the psychological wisdom embedded in stories. His biblical lectures work through Genesis and Exodus verse by verse, drawing out psychological interpretations, connecting them to empirical research and evolutionary theory, and relating them to contemporary challenges. This is explicitly Jungian in approach, treating ancient texts as repositories of archetypal wisdom, but more systematized and more explicitly connected to scientific psychology than Jung's often digressive and associative, interpretive style. Where Jung's writing often meanders, following chains of association and symbolic connection, accumulating examples from different cultures and historical periods, Peterson's presentations tend to be more structured, building systematic arguments, connecting symbolic interpretation to empirical findings, moving toward clear conclusions and practical applications. This reflects both temperamental differences and different contexts. Jung writing for a relatively small audience of analysts and intellectuals, Peterson teaching university students and eventually addressing mass audiences on the Internet. The Internet age has amplified Peterson's influence in ways Jung never experienced. Jung's books were read by thousands, maybe tens of thousands in his lifetime. Peterson's lectures have been viewed by millions on YouTube. This difference in scale and medium affects the relationship between teacher and audience. Jung's analysans had intensely personal relationships with him, working through their individual material over months or years. Peterson's audience receives his teaching as broadcast content, applying it to their own lives individually without the personal relationship or ongoing dialogue. This shift from depth psychology conducted in intimate analytical relationships to psychological wisdom disseminated through mass media is significant. Peterson is reaching more people, but necessarily in a less individually tailored way. His insights need to be generally applicable, his advice broad enough to be useful across many different individual circumstances. Jung could be more specific to the individual, more attentive to the particular symbolic language of each person's unconscious. Yet there is also something powerful about Peterson's approach, making psychological and philosophical wisdom accessible to people who would never enter analysis or read dense academic texts. Jung's ideas remained relatively obscure outside analytical psychology circles. Peterson has brought a Jungian framework to mainstream audiences, helping many people discover the relevance of archetypal thinking and symbolic interpretation to their own lives. Let us turn now to their understandings of suffering, meaning, and tragedy, themes central to both thinkers and areas where their convergence and divergence are particularly illuminating. Both Jung and Peterson take seriously the reality of suffering as an inescapable aspect of human existence. Both reject naive optimism and recognize tragedy as built into the structure of life. Both see the question of how to find or create meaning in the face of suffering as perhaps the central existential challenge. For Jung, suffering often serves a purpose in the individuation process. Neurotic suffering, the suffering that brings people to analysis, typically points to some one-sidedness in consciousness, some aspect of the personality that has been rejected and needs to be integrated. The symptom is the psyche's way of signaling that something is wrong, that the current conscious attitude is unsustainable. Through the suffering, if properly engaged, the person may discover what has been neglected or repressed and move toward greater wholeness. Jung also recognized tragic suffering, the suffering that comes simply from being alive, conscious, and mortal. Consciousness itself involves suffering because it brings awareness of limitations, of loss, of death. The price of consciousness is the knowledge of tragedy. Yet for Jung, this consciousness, this awareness even of painful truths, is valuable. It is better to be conscious, to suffer consciously, than to remain unconscious, even if unconsciousness brings less pain. Consciousness is the purpose, or one purpose, of existence, the universe, becoming aware of itself through human consciousness. Peterson's approach to suffering is similar in recognizing its inevitability, but perhaps more intensely focused on its potential to corrupt and embitter. He is preoccupied with the question of how suffering can lead to resentment, nihilism, and revenge against existence itself. The person who suffers and concludes that life is meaningless, that being is inherently corrupt, that destruction is justified because existence is evil. This is the dangerous outcome Peterson wants to prevent. His emphasis is therefore on finding or creating meaning sufficient to justify suffering. This is a Nietzschean theme. He who has a why to live can bear almost any how. Peterson argues that meaning comes from voluntarily adopting responsibility, from orienting yourself towards something beyond immediate satisfaction, from engaging with challenges that make you stronger and more capable. Meaning is found at the boundary between order and chaos, in the struggle to expand the domain of order into chaos, to master what is unknown and threatening, to reduce suffering in yourself and others. For Peterson, this meaning-making is not arbitrary or merely subjective. It is grounded in the structure of being, in the real opposition between order and chaos, and the real need to navigate between them. When you act to reduce suffering, to increase your competence, to create order from chaos, you are participating in something meaningful because you are genuinely making things better. This is not just a story you tell yourself. It reflects a reality about the nature of being and your role within it. Jung's conception of meaning is somewhat different, less action-oriented and more focused on the symbolic life. For Jung, meaning comes from connection with something greater than the ego, from the sense that one's life is part of a larger pattern or purpose. This connection happens through symbols, through experiences of the numinous, through recognition of archetypal patterns in one's life. The person who can see their suffering as part of a heroic journey, their struggles as a necessary part of individuation, their losses as part of a cycle of death and rebirth, this person has found a symbolic framework that provides meaning. Jung was more accepting of ambiguity and less certain about purposes and outcomes. He trusted the self-regulating nature of the psyche, believing that if a person could maintain a conscious relationship with the unconscious, Meaning would emerge organically from that relationship. He didn't prescribe what the meaning would be, because it would be different for each person, arising from their unique constellation of conscious and unconscious contents, their particular life circumstances, and their individual development path. Peterson is more confident about general patterns of meaning and more willing to prescribe directions. Adopt responsibility, orient toward the good, work to reduce suffering. Tell the truth. These are presented as universally meaningful orientations, grounded in the structure of reality itself, rather than being merely personal preferences. There is something more existentialist in Peterson's approach, a sense that we must create meaning through our choices and actions, that we are responsible for finding or making purpose in a universe that doesn't automatically provide it. Both recognize that religious and mythic frameworks have traditionally provided meaning by situating individual lives within cosmic narratives. You are not just a random collection of atoms temporarily organized before dispersing. You are a soul on a journey, a hero facing trials, a participant in a great drama of creation, fall, and redemption. These narratives make suffering tolerable by giving it context and purpose. You suffer not meaninglessly, but as part of a process, a testing, a necessary stage in development or transformation. Jung explored how these traditional frameworks operate psychologically, what they reveal about the structure of the psyche and the processes of transformation. He was interested in how individuation parallels religious processes like death and rebirth, how the self-archetype appears in religious symbols of wholeness and divinity, how the Gnostic concept of the divine spark within mirrors the analytical concept of the self waiting to be realized. Peterson emphasizes how dangerous it is to lose these traditional frameworks without adequate replacement. Modern secular rationalism has undermined traditional religious narratives but hasn't provided compelling alternatives. Many people find themselves without coherent frameworks for meaning, vulnerable to nihilism, or susceptible to secular ideologies that provide pseudo-religious certainty and purpose. Peterson's project involves recovering the wisdom in traditional narratives, translating them into modern psychological language, and demonstrating their continuing relevance. This brings us to their different relationships with modernity and tradition. Jung lived through modernity's full assault on traditional frameworks, but maintained a kind of phenomenological distance, observing what was happening in the collective psyche without being primarily an advocate for particular solutions. He recognized that consciousness cannot go backward, that one cannot simply return to naive traditional belief after it has been lost. Instead, he sought to understand what remained psychologically valid in traditional symbols and how modern individuals could connect with symbolic life in authentic rather than merely conventional ways. Peterson is more explicitly a defender of traditional wisdom against what he sees as destructive ideologies and naive progressive assumptions. He's critical of postmodernism, of identity politics, of the tendency to deconstruct traditional frameworks without appreciating what they provided or what might be lost in their absence. He argues that traditional values and structures, personal responsibility, the nuclear family, respect for competence hierarchies, the rule of law contain accumulated wisdom that should be respected even if we don't fully understand the reasons for it. This conservatism is tempered by Peterson's simultaneous emphasis on the necessity of renewal and transformation, represented in the heroic willingness to descend into chaos and retrieve new knowledge. The ideal is not static traditionalism, but a balance between conservation of what works and openness to necessary change. Yet Peterson's rhetoric often emphasizes the conservative side of this balance more than the transformative side. perhaps because he perceives the contemporary cultural moment as tilted too far toward deconstruction and chaos. Jung was less politically positioned. His primary concern was always the individual psyche and its development, not social or political advocacy. He recognized collective pathologies but saw the solution primarily in individual consciousness and development rather than political or social programs. If enough individuals achieved genuine consciousness and integration, collective transformation might follow, but it had to begin with the individual. This difference reflects both their contexts and their purposes. Jung was developing a psychological theory and therapeutic method focused on helping individuals achieve wholeness. Peterson is engaged in a broader cultural project, teaching and advocating publicly, concerned with both individual development and the collective health of societies and cultures. Jung's primary audience was analysans and fellow analysts. Peterson's primary audience has become the general public, particularly young men seeking guidance for how to live meaningful lives. That demographic young men is significant. Peterson's message has particularly resonated with young males who feel lost or purposeless in contemporary culture, uncertain about their roles, facing messages that their traditional masculine traits are toxic or dangerous. Peterson offers a vision of masculinity that is neither toxic nor emasculated. The hero who voluntarily confronts danger, the responsible adult who shoulders burdens, the truthful individual who stands up for what is right despite opposition. This is explicitly an archetypal approach to gender, drawing on ancient hero myths and traditional masculine roles, while arguing for their continuing relevance. Jung also explored gender archetypes, particularly through his concepts of anima and animus, the feminine aspect within the masculine psyche, and vice versa. For Jung, psychological wholeness required integrating these contrasexual elements, the man acknowledging and relating consciously to his anima, the woman to her animus. This was controversial then and remains controversial, with critics arguing it essentializes gender and reinforces stereotypes. Peterson's approach to gender is somewhat different, drawing more on evolutionary psychology and observed behavioral and temperamental differences between male and female populations. He argues that certain traits show statistical differences between sexes, men on average higher in physical aggression and interest in things, women on average higher in agreeableness and interest in people, and that these differences have biological bases, while also being overlapping distributions with plenty of individual variation. Peterson uses this to argue against enforced gender parity in all domains, suggesting that free choices in egalitarian societies may produce different outcomes for men and women on average because of these temperamental differences. This has been one of his most controversial positions, seen by critics as justifying discrimination and by supporters as acknowledging biological reality. Jung's position was different, more focused on the symbolic and psychological dimensions of gender and less on behavioral or occupational distributions. He recognized that every individual contains both masculine and feminine aspects, both logos and eros, both animus and anima, and that wholeness requires acknowledging and integrating both regardless of biological sex. This is a more fluid and less essentialist understanding, though Jung too was writing in a particular historical context and made assumptions about gender that reflect his time. Both Jung and Peterson see value in polarity and difference rather than uniformity. Jung's whole psychology is based on the dynamic tension of opposites, consciousness and unconscious, masculine and feminine, order and chaos, light and shadow. Wholeness comes not from eliminating these opposites, but from holding them in creative tension, allowing them to generate new positions through the transcendent function. Similarly, Peterson emphasizes the necessity of difference in hierarchy for generating meaning and value. If everything is identical, nothing has particular meaning or value. Differentiation is required for significance. This respect for polarity and difference extends to their shared critique of totalizing systems that try to force uniformity. For Jung, this appeared in his concerns about collectivism and mass movements that dissolved individual differences into group identity. For Peterson, it appears in his critique of ideologies that try to engineer equality of outcome rather than respecting equality of opportunity, and accepting that different choices and abilities will produce different results. Yet both also emphasize the commonality underlying difference. Jung's collective unconscious is precisely that which we all share, the universal human patterns beneath cultural and individual variation. Peterson's emphasis on archetypal narratives is about recognizing the common patterns that appear across cultures. The paradox is that genuine diversity requires both recognizing differences and acknowledging our common humanity, our shared archetypal foundations. Without commonality, there is no basis for communication or understanding across difference. Without difference, there is nothing to communicate and no one to understand. This brings us to the question of how Jung and Peterson understand the relationship between individual and collective, a theme that runs through both their works and where their emphases differ in illuminating ways. For Jung, the relationship is dialectical. The individual arises from the collective, both in the sense that each person is born into a culture and in the deeper sense that the psyche itself contains collective, transpersonal elements in the collective unconscious. But individuation requires differentiating from the collective, becoming oneself rather than simply enacting collective expectations or being absorbed into mass movements. Yet individuation is not isolation or narcissism. The individuated person remains connected to the collective, but from a position of consciousness and choice rather than unconscious identification. They can participate in collective life without losing themselves in it. They can contribute to the collective from their unique position while maintaining their individual center, the self, toward which individuation moves, is paradoxically both most individual and most universal. It is what makes you uniquely yourself and simultaneously what connects you to all humanity through the archetypal patterns. Jung saw the 20th century's totalitarian movements as catastrophic failures of individuation, masses of people absorbed into collective identities, archetypal energies possessing individuals who had no conscious relationship with their own depths. The solution was more consciousness, more individuation, more individuals who could stand separate from collective movements while still participating consciously in community and culture. Peterson shares Jung's concern about ideological possession and loss of individual consciousness to collective movements. His critique of identity politics and intersectionality is precisely that they subordinate individual identity to group categories, treating people primarily as members of groups defined by race, sex, and other demographics rather than as individuals with unique characteristics and potential. This, Peterson argues, replicates the logic of totalitarian ideologies that submerge the individual in the collective. Peterson's emphasis is more on individual responsibility and individual action than Jung's. Where Jung focused on internal psychological work, attending to dreams, active imagination, analysis as the path to consciousness and integration, Peterson emphasizes external action, adopting responsibility, telling truth, standing up straight, acting to reduce suffering. The internal psychological work is not absent from Peterson's approach, but it's less central than behavioral and attitudinal change. This reflects different therapeutic philosophies as well. Jung trusted the psyche to self-regulate, believing that if consciousness could be brought into proper relationship with the unconscious, transformation would follow naturally, according to the psyche's own wisdom. There's something Taoist in Jung's approach, wu wei, non-forcing, allowing natural processes to unfold. The analyst doesn't impose a predetermined outcome, but facilitates the patient's own process of discovery and integration. Peterson's approach is more active and directive. He prescribes rules for life, behavioral changes, attitudinal shifts. This is more consistent with cognitive behavioral therapy, which emphasizes changing thoughts and behaviors as the path to psychological change. Peterson would argue that these prescriptions are not arbitrary impositions, but distillations of archetypal wisdom, patterns that have proven effective across time and culture. Still, the emphasis is more on doing, on changing behavior and attitude, than on contemplating and integrating unconscious material. These different emphases may partly reflect the different populations they primarily addressed. Jung worked with individuals in analysis, often people experiencing neurotic suffering or seeking deeper meaning, who had the time and resources for long-term psychological exploration. Peterson's audience includes many people seeking practical guidance for navigating life challenges who need actionable advice more than explorations of symbolic depths. His 12 rules for life are explicitly practical: stand up straight, clean your room, compare yourself to who you were yesterday, even as they are grounded in deeper archetypal understanding. Yet we should not overstate this difference. Jung also gave practical advice to analysans, and Peterson also works with symbolic and archetypal material. The difference is one of emphasis and primary focus rather than absolute divergence. Both recognize that psychological health requires both internal work and external action, both symbolic understanding and practical living. Let us now drift toward the deeper waters of their dialogue, the places where their visions meet and diverge, to reveal something about the nature of human consciousness itself, about how we understand ourselves and our place in existence. Both Jung and Peterson are fundamentally concerned with the question of meaning, how human beings create or discover meaning in their lives, what happens when meaning is lost, why certain narratives and symbols carry meaning across cultures and centuries. For Jung, meaning is fundamentally connected to wholeness, to the process of individuation through which the personality develops toward completeness. Meaning is found in recognizing one's life as part of a larger pattern, in experiencing connection with something transpersonal, in the encounter with numinous symbols that bridge conscious and unconscious. The person who says, "My life has meaning," is someone who feels that their existence matters, that they are participating in something significant, that their experiences fit into a coherent pattern even if they don't fully understand it rationally. This meaning often comes through suffering and difficulty. The dark night of the soul, the descent into the underworld, the confrontation with death and dissolution, these are necessary stages in many individuation journeys. What seems like meaningless suffering at the time may later be recognized as a necessary transformation, a death that enabled rebirth. The symbolic understanding of suffering transforms it from mere pain into a meaningful ordeal, a test or initiation or sacrifice that serves a purpose. Peterson similarly sees meaning as arising from difficulty and challenge. Meaningful life is not comfortable or easy, but engaged and effortful. Meaning comes from taking on responsibility, from voluntarily shouldering burdens, from struggling with chaos and attempting to create or restore order. The meaning is in the struggle itself, in the process of development and improvement, not in some final achievement or end state. You don't become meaningful by reaching a goal, but by orienting yourself toward goals worth pursuing and striving toward them despite obstacles. Both understand meaning as narrative in nature. Human beings experience their lives as stories, with beginnings, middles, and anticipated endings, with characters and challenges and developments. We understand ourselves and others primarily through narrative, who we are, where we came from, where we're going, what we've overcome, what we hope to become. The person without a coherent narrative, whose life seems like random, disconnected events without pattern or purpose, struggles to find meaning. But narratives are never purely individual. The stories we use to understand ourselves come from culture, from myths and religions and literature, from the archetypal patterns that recur across human storytelling. The hero's journey is compelling not because any individual invented it, but because it maps onto something real about human development, the call to adventure, the trials and ordeals, the transformation, the return with new knowledge or capacity. When we recognize our life as instantiating this pattern, it provides meaning. We are not just enduring random suffering, but undergoing a heroic ordeal. Jung understood this through his concept of the archetypes, these patterns that structure human experience and appear in stories across cultures are not arbitrary cultural constructions, but arise from the structure of the psyche itself. The collective unconscious contains these archetypal forms, and both individual lives and cultural narratives naturally express them. This is why certain stories remain compelling across centuries. They tap into something universal in human psychology. Peterson grounds this same insight more explicitly in evolutionary psychology and neuroscience. The reason certain narrative patterns recur is that they represent real regularities in the challenges humans have faced over evolutionary time. The hero's journey works as a story because it encodes a pattern that has been genuinely adaptive, recognizing challenges, preparing, venturing forth, overcoming obstacles, returning with new capacities. The predator and prey, the terrible mother and the benevolent father, the virgin and the whore, these recurring figures represent categories that have been significant across human evolutionary history, patterns our brains are prepared to recognize and respond to. So both arrive at similar conclusions through somewhat different routes. Jung approaches it phenomenologically and psychologically. These patterns appear in the psyche and in cultural products because they arise from the collective unconscious. Peterson approaches it more empirically and evolutionarily. These patterns recur because they represent regularities in the world and human challenges that have shaped our cognitive and emotional systems. The result is the same. Certain narratives and symbols carry meaning across cultures because they connect to something fundamental about human nature and the human condition. This shared recognition of the power of myth and symbol for meaning-making is perhaps the deepest convergence between Jung and Peterson. Both reject the modern tendency to dismiss myths as primitive errors or mere entertainment. Both argue that myths encode sophisticated psychological and practical wisdom. Both see the loss of traditional myths and religious frameworks as creating a meaning crisis in modern secular societies. Both believe that recovering the wisdom in myths, translating it into terms modern people can understand and apply, is essential work. Yet their relationship to this mythic material differs. Jung approached myths with wonder and openness, as revelations of the psyche's own nature, as doorways to the numinous. His interpretations were often multivalent, seeing multiple meanings in symbols, comfortable with ambiguity and paradox. He was exploring the symbolic life, mapping territories of the psyche that rational consciousness couldn't fully grasp. His writing has a quality of contemplation and amplification, circling around symbols from multiple angles, accumulating examples and associations. Peterson approaches myths more as encoding practical wisdom, as maps that can guide action, as containing information about how to live and what to do. His interpretations tend toward the moral and the practical. This is what the story teaches about resentment, about sacrifice, about truth-telling, about the consequences of different choices. His style is more systematic and argumentative, building toward clear conclusions and practical applications. He wants to extract the lessons and demonstrate their relevance to contemporary challenges. Neither approach is wrong or complete without the other. Jung's contemplative exploration of symbolic depths needs Peterson's translation into practical wisdom for contemporary life. Peterson's practical applications need Jung's recognition of symbolic multivalence and psychological complexity. Together they represent complementary ways of engaging with the archetypal foundations of human meaning. We must also consider their different relationships with science and empiricism. Jung was trained as a medical doctor and psychiatrist, familiar with scientific methods and empirical research, but he also recognized the limitations of pure empiricism for understanding subjective experience and symbolic realities. The psyche cannot be studied only from outside, only through third-person observation. It must also be known from within, through careful attention to subjective experience, dreams, fantasies, the movements of psychic contents. Jung developed what he called an empirical psychology of the unconscious, based on careful observation and classification of psychological phenomena, but it was a different kind of empiricism than laboratory experimental psychology. Peterson is more embedded in academic scientific psychology, with its emphasis on measurement, statistical analysis, peer-reviewed publication. His research has been conducted within this framework, using standard psychological methods, questionnaires, experiments, statistical correlations. He values the rigor and objectivity of scientific method and is critical of approaches that lack empirical support. Yet, he also recognizes that scientific psychology has often been reductionistic, ignoring or dismissing questions about meaning and value because they seem unscientific. Peterson's project involves integrating scientific psychology with the insights of Jung, mythology, and religious traditions. He wants to show that these are compatible, that the archetypal and symbolic understanding of human nature can be supported by evolutionary psychology, neuroscience, and personality research. The hero's journey isn't just a story, it maps onto real developmental challenges and real neurobiological systems for exploration and threat response. The terrible mother isn't just a symbol, it represents real patterns of overprotective parenting that inhibit development. Patterns we can observe and measure. This integration is ambitious and valuable, but also involves risks of reductionism. Can the full symbolic richness of archetypal reality be captured in empirical categories? Can meaning and value be adequately understood through third-person scientific study? Peterson would argue that multiple levels of analysis are possible. We can understand phenomena both scientifically and symbolically, both objectively and subjectively, and these different levels complement rather than contradict each other. Jung was more comfortable maintaining the tension between scientific and symbolic understanding without insisting they be fully integrated. He used both languages, sometimes talking about archetypes in quasi-biological terms as inherited structures, sometimes talking about them in more mystical terms as spiritual realities. He was more willing to say that the psyche contains mysteries that rational consciousness cannot fully grasp, that we must sometimes rest in uncertainty and paradox rather than demanding clear, systematic explanations. This points to a temperamental difference. Peterson has a drive toward systematization and clarity, toward building comprehensive frameworks that integrate different domains of knowledge. His maps of meaning is an attempt at such a comprehensive system, integrating mythology, psychology, neuroscience, and philosophy into a unified understanding of how human beings create and navigate meaning. Jung was more comfortable with incompleteness and ambiguity, with exploring territories without necessarily mapping them fully or fitting all the pieces into a clear system. Both approaches have value. Peterson's systematizing makes the insights more accessible and practically applicable, shows connections across domains, builds bridges between scientific and humanistic understanding. Jung's comfort with ambiguity preserves the mystery and complexity of psychological reality, avoids premature closure, remains open to dimensions that don't fit neat categories. In their different ways, both Jung and Peterson are engaged in the ancient project of understanding human nature and the human condition, of asking what it means to be human, how we should live, what gives life meaning and value. They draw on different sources, Jung more on philosophy, religion, alchemy, mythology, Peterson more on evolutionary biology, neuroscience, empirical psychology, but they arrive at similar conclusions about the importance of meaning, responsibility, consciousness, and the integration of archetypal wisdom. Perhaps what their dialogue reveals most powerfully is that human psychology cannot be understood purely from outside, through third-person observation and measurement, nor purely from inside, through subjective contemplation and symbolic exploration. Both perspectives are necessary. We need the objective study of behavior and biology and brain systems. We also need the exploration of meaning and value and symbolic experience. We need empirical psychology and depth psychology, neuroscience and mythology, measurement and interpretation. The divided consciousness of modernity, the split between scientific rationalism and humanistic meaning-making, between facts and values, between objective truth and subjective significance, this division that has haunted Western culture since the Enlightenment may be partly healed by approaches like Jung's and Peterson's that refuse to choose one side. Absolutely. Jung never abandoned scientific thinking, even as he explored the symbolic depths. Peterson doesn't abandon archetypal understanding, even as he engages with empirical research. Their convergence and divergence map a territory that psychology and culture as a whole must navigate. How do we integrate scientific understanding of human nature with the wisdom traditions of meaning and value? How do we honor both the individual and the collective, both consciousness and the unconscious, both stability and transformation? How do we find or create meaning in a world that doesn't automatically provide it, in the face of suffering and limitation and mortality? Jung's answer was primarily through individual psychological work, through the long process of individuation, through bringing consciousness into relationship with the unconscious depths, through recognizing and integrating the shadow, through experiencing the numinous and allowing transformation. This requires patience, courage, and willingness to descend into darkness without guarantee of what will be found there. Peterson's answer emphasizes taking on responsibility, telling truth, acting to reduce suffering, orienting toward meaning rather than expedience. This requires discipline, courage, and willingness to face difficulty voluntarily rather than waiting for it to overwhelm you. It means adopting burdens rather than fleeing them, standing up straight even when you could slouch, speaking truth even when lies would be more comfortable. These are not contradictory, but complementary approaches. The internal work of understanding oneself, of integrating rejected parts, of attending to unconscious communications needs to be matched by external action, by implementing what is learned, by taking responsibility for one's life and choices. Conversely, the active adoption of responsibility and truthful action needs to be informed by self-understanding, by recognition of one's shadow and motives, by connection to something beyond mere ego gratification. Together, Jung and Peterson offer a vision of human development that is both ancient and contemporary, both mythological and scientific, both inward and outward. The individuating person in Jung's sense, bringing consciousness into proper relationship with the unconscious, integrating shadow and contrasexual elements, following the path toward wholeness. This is also the responsible hero, in Peterson's sense, voluntarily confronting chaos, extracting order and meaning, shouldering burdens, speaking truth, orienting toward the good. This vision stands opposed to both naive optimism and nihilistic despair. Against naive optimism, it recognizes that existence involves suffering, limitation, tragedy, that consciousness brings knowledge of mortality and finitude, that evil is a real potential in every human heart. Against nihilistic despair, it insists that meaning is possible, that responsibility is real, that action matters, that we can make things better or worse through our choices, that consciousness and development are valuable even in the face of tragedy. Both Jung and Peterson recognize that human beings are meaning-making creatures, that we cannot not interpret, cannot not organize, experience into patterns and narratives, cannot not create or discover value and significance. The question is not whether we will engage in meaning-making, but whether we will do it consciously or unconsciously, whether our maps will be accurate or distorted, whether we will orient toward genuine meaning or false substitutes, whether we will create sustainable patterns or destructive ones. The archetypal patterns, they both emphasize the hero's journey, the balance of order and chaos, the confrontation with the shadow. The integration of opposites are not arbitrary cultural constructions, but patterns that have proven themselves across human history and prehistory. They represent accumulated wisdom about challenges that every human being faces in some form. How to develop from childhood to adulthood, how to navigate between security and growth, how to acknowledge one's own darkness without being overwhelmed by it, how to find balance between opposing tendencies and demands. In making this wisdom accessible, in translating it from ancient symbolic languages into contemporary psychological concepts, both Jung and Peterson perform an invaluable service. Many modern people have been cut off from traditional sources of wisdom and meaning living in secular cultures that provide material comfort but existential emptiness. The marketplace cannot provide meaning, technology cannot provide wisdom, and pure rationalism cannot tell us how to live or what to value. Jung recognized this crisis over a century ago, saw it developing as traditional religious frameworks lost their power, warned about the dangers when archetypal energies have no proper channels and return in destructive forms. Peterson sees the continuation and intensification of this crisis, the spread of nihilism and ideological possession, young people lost and without direction. Both offer paths forward that recover ancient wisdom while remaining intellectually honest, that take seriously both scientific understanding and mythological meaning. The dialogue between their perspectives enriches both. Jung's depth and symbolic sophistication prevents Peterson's practical emphasis from becoming superficial or reductionistic. Peterson's systematizing and operationalizing prevents Jung's insights from remaining obscure and inaccessible to those who need them. Jung maps the depths. Peterson provides the practical wisdom for the journey. Jung shows the territory. Peterson helps you navigate it. As we drift toward the end of our exploration, let us return to where we began, to the recognition that some thinkers speak across time, their conversations continuing in the minds of those who engage with both, their insights combining to illuminate what neither alone completely reveals. Carl Jung and Jordan Peterson have never met in any literal sense. Jung died the year before Peterson was born, on opposite sides of an ocean, in different worlds in many respects. Yet they meet in the realm of ideas, in the territory of archetypes and myths and meanings, in the question of how human beings create order from chaos, consciousness from unconsciousness, meaning from suffering. They meet in their shared conviction that myths are not lies, but truths of a different kind, that traditional wisdom deserves respect and careful interpretation, that consciousness and responsibility are essential human tasks. Their dialogue continues in everyone who reads both, who recognizes archetypal patterns in their own life, who struggles to find meaning in a secular age, who tries to navigate between order and chaos, consciousness and unconsciousness, stability and growth. The individuating person in Jungian analysis and the responsible hero in Peterson's vision are not different people, but the same person approached from complementary angles, described in different languages, emphasized in different aspects. What both ultimately offer is hope grounded in realism. Not the false hope that life will be easy or suffering can be eliminated, but the genuine hope that meaning is possible, that consciousness matters, that our actions have significance, that we can develop and grow and become more than we are. The journey is difficult, the destination uncertain, the way often dark and confusing, but it is navigable. Maps exist, wisdom has accumulated, patterns can guide us. We are not the first to face these challenges, and the accumulated experience of those who came before, encoded in myths and symbols and psychological understanding, remains available to us. Jung devoted his life to excavating and articulating this wisdom, to showing how the ancient symbols still live in the modern psyche, to developing methods for conscious engagement with unconscious depths. Peterson has devoted much of his career to translating this wisdom into contemporary language, to demonstrating its practical relevance, to helping people apply archetypal insights to their actual lives and challenges. In their convergence, we see the power of archetypal thinking, the recognition that beneath cultural surface variations lie common patterns of human experience and human development. In their divergence, we see complementary emphases, depth and practicality, contemplation and action, psychological exploration and behavioral implementation. Both are necessary. Neither alone is sufficient. The conversation between Jung and Peterson is ultimately a conversation about what it means to be human, about the challenges and possibilities of conscious existence, about how we create or discover meaning in a world that can seem meaningless, about how we develop from who we are to who we might become. It is a conversation that continues in each of us who engage with these questions, who struggle with meaning and responsibility and growth, who try to understand ourselves and our place in existence. As you drift towards sleep now, carrying these ideas with you into the unconscious regions of dream and restoration, consider how these patterns appear in your own life. Where are you in the hero's journey? What chaos are you facing or avoiding? What responsibilities are calling to you? What shadow elements need acknowledgement? What does your unconscious communicate in dreams and fantasies and unexpected emotions? What myths and stories resonate with your experience? What gives your life meaning, or what meaning are you seeking? These questions have no easy answers, no final resolutions. They are the questions of a lifetime, the questions that individuation and growth continually pose. But they are navigable questions. Wisdom exists. Patterns can guide. Consciousness can develop. Meaning can be found or created. The journey is difficult but possible, tragic but meaningful, individual but connected to all humanity through archetypal patterns we all share. Jung and Peterson, separated by decades and continents, meet in this understanding. Their dialogue across time continues in you, in your engagement with meaning and consciousness, in your struggle to create order from chaos, to bring light into darkness, to become more fully yourself while connecting with something greater than yourself. May their combined wisdom guide your journey, providing maps for your unique voyage through the territories of human existence. The night deepens now. The conscious mind releases its grip. In the realm of sleep and dream, the unconscious speaks its symbolic language, weaving patterns older than any individual, connecting you to the collective foundations of human experience. Rest in this connection. Trust the process of integration and development that continues even in sleep. Tomorrow will bring new challenges and opportunities to apply what you have learned, to take another step in your ongoing journey toward meaning and wholeness. Welcome to the conversation between great minds. Welcome to your own individuation. Welcome to the hero's journey that is your life.